You're muted.
I'm sorry, I was muted. I'm back on now. Good evening, I was saying, and welcome to this virtual panel, which discusses new terrorism trends and de-radicalization in the Mediterranean region in pandemic times. This event that takes place within the frame of the Mediterranean Dialogues, promoted by ISPI with the Italian Ministry of Foreign Affairs and International Cooperation, which besides the main annual meetings that take place in December in Rome, also hosts several other debates throughout the year on issues which are relevant to the area. And I invite you, therefore, to check the calendar in order to keep up with a very interesting program. The panel, which is about to kick-start, will last about 60 minutes, and there will be time for a few questions from the audience towards the end. Today's discussion is very timely. 2 years into the pandemic, its impact on terrorism, radicalization, and counter-extremism activities can now be more clearly assessed. We are also just past the 9/11 20th anniversary, and the threat of terrorism has not vanished. It has become geographically more widespread and complex to deal with. In Europe especially, where profiles have changed considerably over the past couple of years. It has become more improvised and independent from established organizations, and there's also a wider array of motivations. COVID-19 did not have such a significant impact on terrorist violence, but jihadist groups, like many other extremists, grabbed the chance to further disseminate their own narrative and reach out to vulnerable individuals, especially youngsters, over the internet. Throughout the past 2 decades, then, national, international, and academic institutions promoted a great deal of multidisciplinary work in the realms of prevention, of de-radicalization and research. Some initiatives suffered from practical setbacks. Some approaches and strategies were criticized by scholars and/or practitioners. It's a good time to take stock of all this work at a critical moment. So here we have distinguished guests who will provide us with an updated picture of the situation on the two shores of the Mediterranean. We will start with a pre-recorded intervention of Professor Keppel, who could not be with us in person today, but was very kind and happy to find some time for us the other day. G. Keppel is a major scholar of contemporary Middle East and Islam in the West, and professor at the École Normale Supérieure in Paris and Università della Svizzera Italiana in Lugano. So I'd say let's start with his intervention on the contemporary threat of jihadism with a focus on Europe and France. So let's immediately focus on this, on jihadism, on the latest trends in jihadism. Professor Keppel, you described post-ISIS jihadism as jihadism of atmosphere, a phenomenon which does not spare any country and sees the internet and social media play a major role. Could you explain the characteristics and the implications of jihadism of atmosphere and how this phenomenon has been evolving throughout the pandemic?
Well, thank you very much for having me, and sorry not to be able to be with you live. The phenomena that we just witnessed in Europe over the last years, after ISIS was finally destroyed as an organization that was able to export jihadism from the Levant, from Syria and Iraq, which happened in 2019 after the coalition bombed its last hideout in Bahrouz in Syria by the Iraqi border. Since then, there has been a transformation in jihadism because even though ISIS survives on the ground, and we saw recently that its last caliph, quote unquote, was executed in Atme near the Turkish border in Syria by American special forces. They had led a daunting attack on a prison in Hasakeh in northeastern Syria, where a number of ISIS prisoners were held captive by the Kurdish forces. Hence, there is a resilience of ISIS on the ground, but it does not have, as of now, the capacity to launch the attacks that we witnessed, for instance, in November 2015 with the attack on the Bataclan in France, which are a standing trial at the present in France. Nevertheless, we saw, and that coincided to some extent with the pandemic, a number of new types of jihadist attacks which were not linked to organizations. The first wave took place when the Charlie Hebdo trial took place in France in September 2020, and the cartoonists decided to republish the cartoons with the caption "Tout ça pour ça," all this for that. And this was considered in some sectors in the Muslim world as a provocation, as a new attack on Islam and the like. And the ambers were fanned by a number of actors, especially on the internet, but not only. The first phenomenon was that a Pakistani illegal immigrant who was in France and who had watched demonstrations against the cartoonists on his cell phone, demonstrations that took place in Karachi or other places in Pakistan, where people were holding cutlasses and wishing to behead the cartoonists, decided to act according to that, bought meat cleavers at a shop nearby, and then went to the former place where Charlie Hebdo had its seat, and then attacked two people who had nothing to do with that because it had more. So the guy knew absolutely no French, very little English, had no idea what he was doing, but he did not belong to an organization. He just reacted to this atmosphere that had been created on the web, took it on him. And then this is when President Macron made his famous speech on October 2nd in 2020 in Les Mureaux near Paris, where in June 2016, a policeman and his wife had been stabbed to death at their home by a jihadist who had just left prison. And then he incriminated what he called Islamist separatism, i.e. the fact that a number of movements among the militants would consider that the issue was not to integrate in Western societies, but rather to create enclaves, that they would pay lip service to the law of the country, but they would separate themselves physically, intellectually, legally from the rest of society. And that would lead to this kind of behavior. This was attacked very violently, particularly from Turkey and other places. There were, again, a number of demonstrations. And only 2 weeks after, in a way, the matter was proven because a professor in a school who had showed to pupils the cartoons in order to discuss about freedom of expression, then was denunciated online by some of the pupils' parents, and then this went viral. The video went viral, and through a number of Islamist associations in France and abroad. And then someone else who had nothing to do with those associations, who had identified the professor but not asked explicitly for him to be assassinated. Then a Chechen guy decided to carry the assassination, then went to the school, bribed some pupils to know who he was exactly, and then beheaded him in front of the school, which was a shock of horror. And then we had another affair when a Tunisian refugee who had just crossed into France from Ventimiglia stabbed 3 people to death in Nice, in the Basilica of Nice. From what we know, he had no link whatsoever with the jihadi movement. He had just boarded on a ship to go to Lampedusa, was probably radicalized while he was in a confinement in Bari or somewhere on the way, and then was convinced that if he killed 3 infidels, quote unquote, in a church on the day that was the anniversary of the Prophet, he would go to paradise. This is what we know. So here we have a very different type of things as opposed to ISIS or Al-Qaeda, when you had orders that were given from the top, and this was clearly new, and we had to think in terms of renewing the concepts, how to understand the challenge and the phenomenon, and this is why I sort of designed this idea of jihadism of atmosphere, which on the one hand stressed the importance of what was becoming viral on the web, and that was spreading virally, just like the virus to some extent, with the atmosphere through which COVID-19 was propagated. And then some individuals would be contaminated and go to action. So it's a rather different model of propagation than the top-down organization that was Al-Qaeda, or the network-based organization that was ISIS. And so this, of course, was something that was very problematic for the law and order institutions, because the police is used to sort of identify someone and then try to see who gave the orders, who were the accomplices, and the like. With a physical dimension, this did not exist in this case. So it was much more difficult. How do you deal with the atmospheric dimension, with its danger, even though there is a lot of online surveillance and the like now? Now, another thing which was, less problematic was that it is more difficult for a single individual to accumulate, let's say, weapons of terrorist mass destruction, i.e. firearms are more difficult to get when you're an organization. You can have a knife, you can stab people, you can have a car and run over people, which is, of course, lethal, but machine gunning people is more complicated. So hence, the combination of, a crude surveillance, the capacity of law and order institutions to analyze this phenomenon in real time, whereas in the past, it took years to understand how Al-Qaeda functioned, and then years to understand how Al-Qaeda had muted into ISIS, to some extent led to the fact that this phenomenon was not as dangerous as we had feared. So this is where we are now. And nevertheless, I believe that the conflicts which are still ripe in the Levant, the problems in North Africa, and probably the fact that immigration tidal waves will start again after COVID, of course, compel ourselves to ready us for this coming challenge.
How can we fight radicalization into jihadism when it spreads through the internet, through the digital space? Are we doing enough? There is nothing more that can be done, or are there some other challenges that have not been yet answered?
Well, this is the real difficulty. That is, fighting jihadism as a criminal act is something that belongs to CT, to counterterrorism, to the arsenal of repression, and so on and so forth. And, you have a definition of terrorist crime, which is more or less something on which people agree, except that some believe that terrorists are heroes and vice versa. But in a given society, there are legal instruments. Now, in the realm of ideas and of ideas which are propagated on the internet, it is much more complicated, because where do we draw the line between freedom of expression and the safeguarding of public security? And here, this was one of the reasons why there were so many reactions after Macron's speech, and hostile reactions in many networks that considered that, this was Islamophobia, that you were criminalizing Islam, and which was not the case. And the issue was to understand where a number of ideas that were spread on the web were leading to the fracturing of society, to the building of hostile enclaves that would lead through the social networks to, criminal act, which is something which is conceptually, which is difficult to deal with, when you open the web and look for any definition of an Islamic concept, etc., what you immediately find are pages and pages and pages of Salafi doctrine. And so the issue is a battle of contents on the internet and the web. And people who are interested in putting forward the most radical or extreme understandings and interpretations of Islam as a religion, which is far more pluralistic, are far more potent on the web than what represents the majority of Muslims who have nothing to do with violence or jihad or beheadings or the like. And so this is the sort of gray zone of the internet, which is a big issue. But it's not only something that has to do with atmospheric jihadism. I mean, conspiracy theories spread on the web like mushrooms, and QAnon conspiracy theories that seem to have been so potent for the mobilization of truck drivers in Canada or in Europe nowadays, to some extent are part and parcel of the same phenomenon. So in a way, Salafi and radical Islamist movements did not invent anything. They just, went on, jumped on the bandwagon.
in this discussion, we are also tackling de-radicalization, which is a contested, which has many contested approaches. De-radicalization programs and efforts in France, the UK, and other European countries have met with much criticism in the past, especially after deadly attacks by former convicts, former radicalized inmates. On the other hand, de-radicalization is a long-term process. It can fail for different reasons and does not offer any guarantee of success. So what is your overall evaluation of approaches and strategies underlying de-radicalization programs in Europe, and where do you see shortcomings that should be addressed?
Well, most of the de-radicalization programs were conducted with a fear to address doctrinal issues. Because particularly in the European Union, they were fearful of looking like Islamophobes. And so you would leave the doctrine and ideology aside and, concentrate on family antecedents or, lack of education, violence in your childhood, things which may be part and parcel of the whole process, but do not necessarily lead you to becoming a jihadi. So, when you mentioned former convicts, actually, prisons in Europe, in France and other places became incubators for jihadism, and people who were ordinary convicts who were tutored in jail by other inmates that, it was not their fault, that he had done something wrong. It was because it was an infidel society, and the only way to be redeemed for what they had done was to fight for jihad, and so on and so forth. And so there, I believe that this issue has to address ideology, and this is why, for instance, we are really weak nowadays in Europe in terms of, the studies of Islamology have gone down tremendously. I mean, in Italy, you still have a very impressive center in l'Orientale in Napoli, but it's one drop of water in the ocean, and the same for France and other countries. So I believe that this is a big issue, and the French institutions just launched last week the new Institut Français d'Islamologie, which focuses precisely on the study of the texts of the Islamic tradition in their pluralism. Whereas, as I mentioned earlier on, if you open your web, you have an idea of Islam as something which is totally hijacked by Salafis.
Fine. I think we have enough, more than enough food for thought for this panel. Thank you very much, Professor Keppel.
My pleasure.
Here we are. We had this very articulated focus on the situation in France with its ramifications. But let's broaden the perspective now with Dr. Julie Coleman, head of the Prevention and Countering Violent Extremism program at the International Center for Counter-Terrorism. Dr. Coleman, in recent years, in order to prevent radicalization, there has been a growing global consensus on the need to understand what factors attract young people to join extremist groups. And my question is, what should we retain, in particular from field experience and from the vast amount of research which was carried out into these issues? What are the primary motivations of youth to join terrorist groups, and to what extent has the pandemic intersected or exacerbated existing drivers of radicalization and influence recruitment in the MENA region as well as in the Sahel specifically.
Sure. Well, I think as an initial thought, I think it's very important to really remember that radicalization to violence is a deeply individual process. And this is what I think the fundamental challenge is. There's no one set pathway. There's no one set trajectory that young people take that results in their engagement in terrorism or in violent extremism. And this, I think, is what has really plagued researchers and practitioners and governments alike in trying to figure out what those factors are, particularly because what we see is such a small number ultimately radicalized to violence that the same person subject to certain conditions that leads them to engage in terrorism can lead in a very different outcome in others. So this is all to say, it's a very heterogeneous group that we're looking at when we look at youth who radicalize to violence. And different, experts and researchers have sort of conceptualized the different common factors that we see in sort of different ways. They've used different terminology, but I think there are some common elements, at least, that we can start to draw out. Some have framed this as push and pull factors. So the negative social and economic factors, as well as the positive benefits that one gets from joining a group. Others have looked at it as, young people who are fighting against something. They want something to fight against and they want something to fight for. Whereas others have framed it as sort of what is sometimes called the 3 N's. So needs, narratives, and networks. Needs is the need to feel important. Narrative is the narrative that justifies the use of violence to feel important, to feel significant. And networks would be those around you that sort of enable the entry into the group. So those are just a few of the different frameworks that have been identified for why young people engage in terrorism. But I think what you see across all of those and many other, paradigms for looking at this phenomenon, you see often think the 3 maybe common factors that I would group together are you see, very genuine grievances, particularly amongst young people. So these can be, abuses that are conducted by state forces, repression by the state. It can also just be, societal discrimination and marginalization, a feeling that you're othered or that you're treated as not really part of the society in which you exist, in which you live. And those grievances are unfortunately sort of the lifeblood of terrorist groups and of terrorist propaganda. They frame themselves as the advocates for justice, to counter these injustices. And they really play into those grievances to create this us versus them narrative. And of course, this is what you see across jihadist propaganda, online and offline alike. But then you also see in other cases, young people who maybe are enticed or lured into groups for either financial gain or thrill seeking. But I also think that more importantly than those factors is that it gives them a sense of belonging. Often these are young people who have indeed been marginalized and not ever really fit in to the mainstream society. And this gives them, a kinship, a comradeship, a group to sort of find their self-identity within. And then we often obviously also see that there's some sort of network, whether this is an online network or offline, in person, you often see that there's that sort of gateway that allows them to tap into the extremist ideology and the extremist rhetoric and propaganda. And these factors together kind of coalesce to sort of underline or underlie the reasons why young people engage in terrorism. Within that, though, of course, I would say there are, some very distinct differences from what we see in Europe versus in the MENA region or in the Sahel region and elsewhere. And of course, in the MENA region, in the Sahel region, those grievances that I mentioned are often very real and very pervasive in the lives of young people. You have governments who are, at best unresponsive to the needs of their citizens. They're failing to provide very basic necessities and services, healthcare, education, things of that nature. And at worst, these are actively repressive governments who are often committing abuses against their own citizens. So what we see in those regions is there may be higher levels of engagement in terrorism because of the real prevalence of these grievances and of these abuses by the different state actors. And so that's something that I think, as Europe, in terms of looking to address the problem of violent extremism, that's a great starting point for how you, prevent the conditions from being conducive to terrorism, address these factors of basic good governance. And I think that's a really effective way to already start to counter this challenge. As for how the pandemic has kind of exacerbated this, I think in your opening remarks, you highlighted that fortunately, I think the pandemic has not led to sort of an even greater expansion of violent extremism in the way that we perhaps feared it would. But still, I think what the pandemic has done is indeed turn attention of state actors, of others, away from the problem of terrorism towards, tackling the global health crisis and looking at more domestic concerns or less security-related concerns. And so I think that, as I look at the future, as we reflect on the last 20 years, I think that there needs to be a constancy from government actors in recognizing that the efforts to counter terrorism are still very much needed, and it needs to be a sustained effort going forward. So the pandemic, shouldn't be, used as an excuse to kind of look away or turn away from this challenge. And so I hope indeed going forward that won't be the case.
Thank you, Dr. Coleman. Let's focus again now and specifically on Tunisia, which is the country of origin for the highest number of foreign terrorist fighters per capita in the world. So we go now to Dr. Emna Ben Arab, who is assistant professor at the University of Sfax. Dr. Ben Arab, how do you evaluate the approaches to countering violent extremism, which were adopted by successive Tunisian governments over the past decade? Did they address the drivers of radicalization, and how do they respond to the challenges of de-radicalization and integration of repatriated combatants? And again, will the pandemic have a long-lasting impact on those activities?
Thank you. So true, yes, unprecedented numbers of Tunisian nationals have joined jihadi extremist groups in Syria and Iraq as foreign fighters. And this was a wake-up call as to the magnitude of violent extremism in the country and the potential radicalization process that some fringe groups are undergoing. And this even took authorities by surprise, which explains the quick fixes adopted through a series of piecemeal security-focused policies, rather than a comprehensive strategy based on an integrated approach. So all along, the counter-terrorism strategy adopted by all 14 governments during the last decade has been essentially reactive and security-centered, focusing almost exclusively on punitive measures based on the counter-terrorism law that was enacted in 2015. And although the adoption of the national strategy for counter-terrorism a year later, that is in 2016, seemed to announce a change of direction in the fight against extremism, because it embraces a comprehensive approach with an emphasis on prevention. It has not been accompanied by a preventive operational strategy that goes beyond security in the narrowest sense. And this is due to many factors, mainly the poor institutional coordination, the numerous administrative obstacles, the fragmentation of stakeholders and resources, but also, I think, to the failure of authorities to prioritize the root causes of terrorism. Priority has always been given to empowering and reinforcing security forces, which did happen thanks in part to collaboration with international partners. But the core grievances and root causes that motivated Tunisian youth to join jihadist groups have not only remained unaddressed, but have also been exacerbated by the unsatisfactory governmental responses to the pandemic. And this obviously led to further tensions and socioeconomic fragility, mainly in the historically marginalized regions of Tunisia. And here it should be pointed out that the pandemic did not only amplify existing grievances, but also provided the terrorist groups with a captive audience of a significant number of youth who were no longer in full-time education. They were captivated in their confirmation bubbles that reinforce the positive aspects of the violent extremist messages. And here, let me say that even before the pandemic, and according to a UN report, 25% of Tunisian youth, and for that matter, even Jordanian youth, and this is the highest rate in the region, are what is called NEET. They are not in education, not in employment, and not in training. They were behind their devices online, swallowed in and by a subculture of like-minded people that helps them find what they were looking for: belonging and fulfillment. And it is mainly this profile that constitutes most of what came to be called during the pandemic the bedroom radicals. These are lone wolf terrorists who were radicalized online while spending months at home. These were bred during lockdown. So to go back to the counter-terrorism responses, security-based responses, though unnecessary, have by no means been sufficient to effectively deal with this multidimensional threat. They have not obviously been complemented by a preventive approach based on sustainable development that addresses the structural drivers of extremism and terrorism, and also on rebuilding the already frayed social contract. And this, together with the prospect of the terrorist rehabilitation being minimal, whether inside prisons or after their release. And if we have time, we can talk about this. I would say that at least a fraction of these terrorists will continue to pose a challenge to security in Tunisia, a challenge that authorities as well as civil society organizations are ill-equipped and lack resources to cope with. It is a challenge that includes not only terrorists operating in Tunisia, but also returning fighters, and also a substantial number of their children who, have been taken to Syria and Iraq, or were born there, and these could represent a potential vehicle for ideological continuity.
Thank you, Dr. Benarab, for this very comprehensive overview. Of course, we could elaborate, but we prefer to leave it to our audience with their questions at the end of our session. Now, there is one event which is looming over the jihadist landscape, the threat landscape, and that event happened last August. So I'm already introducing Antonio Giustozzi, Associate Research Fellow, Radicalization and International Terrorism, ISPI. Antonio Giustozzi, in considering the post-Afghanistan landscape, so that is the event that I was referring to, the Taliban takeover, where the landscape where the precipitous US withdrawal was followed by the Taliban takeover. May other Islamist extremist groups view the rise to power and the governance style of the Taliban as a model for other parts of the world? What kind of influence will the Taliban takeover have on the jihadi networks in Afghanistan and worldwide?
Thank you for your question. I think I would distinguish between the emirate, the Taliban emirate, which has been reestablished in Afghanistan, and the conquest of power by the Taliban. I think there are different dimensions that have a different impact in terms of the jihadi galaxy in the world. I think the emirate as such is unlikely, in my view, to be going to represent much of a positive model for jihadists, in part because it's pretty clear that the Biden administration is doing what it can to undermine it and preempt its consolidation. So, a state that essentially would be begging for support from around the world and will be struggling financially and would be dependent on handouts, humanitarian handouts, is probably not going to be very attractive for jihadists. And there are already signs that Al-Qaeda, for example, has been critical of the attitude of the emirate, has criticized, for example, quite strongly the decision of the emirate to collaborate with the United Nations and accept that the salaries of teachers, for example, will be paid through the United Nations, not through the government. And they really even bothered to issue a video about this. But also on social media, you can see that the desperate attempts of the emirate to establish positive relations with, especially with China, but also with Russia, are very heavily criticized by Qaedists, although it is not an official position of Al-Qaeda, but individual Qaedists are very aggressive on this, and we understand that there's been quite a few tough meetings between the Taliban and Al-Qaeda over this kind of issues. The reason being, of course, that neither Russia nor China are very popular governments with jihadists of any kind, because they're seen as perhaps, especially Russia, even worse enemies of Islam, so to speak, than America. So I don't think that on that front we're going to see a lot of positive impact for the foreseeable future. Instead, I think that the path to power of the Taliban is probably of considerable interest to many jihadist organizations, not so much to the global jihadists or Al-Qaeda, Islamic State, but to, let's call them, national jihadist organization or local jihadist organizations, because the way it happened and the way, the path that is taking after the Taliban reached power, consolidate or strengthened a trend we've already seen emerging before, especially in Syria. Where Ayatollah Sham, which, let's not forget about it, used to be at one point the most promising, before becoming actually Ayatollah Sham, when he was still al-Nusra, was the most promising branch of Al-Qaeda the world over. And in terms of numbers, in terms of prospects, severed links with Al-Qaeda. Not only that, but started, in fact, collaborating with Americans against Al-Qaeda, because it's pretty obvious that these high-precision strikes that are taking place in the Idlib area, targeting very precisely members of Al-Qaeda or Al-Qaeda connected organizations, wouldn't be possible without some sharing of intelligence. And certainly Ayatollah Sham himself has been detaining and fighting Al-Qaeda branches in Idlib, in the area that he controls. So that was a very major blow to Al-Qaeda as an important development. And if you look at the reaction of Ayatollah Sham, they've been among those who welcomed most enthusiastically the power grab of the Taliban, because to them that is going to become another national path, a national jihadist path to power that bypasses the global jihadist, and in a sense reinforces, the opposition. And I think for many other national jihadist organizations, there are a lot of them. In fact, some of these organizations are even bigger than their mother organization, Al-Qaeda. For example, Al-Shabaab in Somalia certainly is bigger than Al-Qaeda probably around the world now. So some of these organizations are quite big now. They have their own source of funding. They are quite independent financially from Al-Qaeda. They have their own connection well beyond Al-Qaeda, directly with states, directly with other jihadist organizations. And they have already absorbed a lot of skills and capabilities. And they are thinking now in terms, realistically, how do we get to power? Does it help at all to have the Al-Qaeda flag flying over your head? Probably not. Probably is actually very counterproductive. So they're looking very carefully at Afghanistan as a path that could facilitate the rise to power. And of course, the Taliban are the first ones that have actually, taken power, because Ayatollah Sham managed to survive thanks to its betrayal of Al-Qaeda, but is not in power, of course. It's surviving somehow in Idlib, has established, of course, close relations with some states of the region, some covert relations with the Americans, but is not in power, and there's no prospect of it, of course, taking Damascus. And the Taliban, in that sense, could become a model for reaching power, because negotiation they undertook with Americans. And I think decisive will be the attitude of the Taliban, especially if they come more into the open towards Al-Qaeda, because that's that of course what makes a difference. I think the jihadist organizations will be looking at how the Taliban addresses the issue and handle it in a way that is, from their point of view, constructive. So the Taliban clearly trying not to have too much of a traumatic cut, but at the same time to sideline Al-Qaeda and kind of quarantine Al-Qaeda and Al-Qaeda connected organization. If that attempts succeed, that could represent a new model for other jihadist national organizations, to secure a more firm path to power.
Thank you, Dr. Giustozzi. I see that there are questions coming in, so I suggest we take a second round of questions. We focus a little bit more. We are a little bit more concise so that we can answer more questions from the audience. So I'll go back to Emna Ben Arab. How could the recent national developments, for example, the demise of another party and its ousting from power in July 2021, and the regional conjuncture, such as the security situation in Libya, the tensions in the Sahel, the US withdrawal from Afghanistan, further fuel the terrorism threat confronting Tunisia?
Right. Indeed, recent national and international developments are likely to have an impact on the trajectory of terrorist groups and their activities in Tunisia, namely, as you mentioned, the demise of a Nahda party and its ousting of from power following July 25th exceptional measures. These measures were labeled by Nahda as a coup against legitimacy. So here, the president, by declaring an emergency, freezing parliament, dismissing the prime minister, and amassing all powers in his hands, he put a sudden end to a decade-long rule of the Islamist and Nahda party, a period notorious for weak economic performance, unemployment, corruption, and also the mishandling of the COVID-19 pandemic. But despite this move, whose purpose it was claimed was to put an end to the overall malaise that has set in, political uncertainty and socioeconomic distress remain a salient feature of the current situation. Adding to that is the democratic backsliding, the state of de-democratization that the country is undergoing now. And this, of course, allowed Islamist parties and their supporters across the aisle to view the new situation as repressive and reneging on the promises of the revolution, and they've become more vocal in their rhetoric, more manipulative, especially that they have begun to feel besieged by a hostile state apparatus and also a sizable portion of the population who have started to ask for or to ask authorities to uncover what is known as the secret apparatus of the party and the involvement of party leadership in sending foreign fighters to Syria and Iraq. So as such, the situation is conducive, especially if there is no return to constitutional institutions. It is conducive to the entrenchment of a more extreme form of political religious expression, the hardcore of which already exists through the Karama Alliance Party, and probably to the re-emergence of violent extremism in the form of terror attacks or traveling to safe havens for training and engaging in a new project such as Afghanistan, which is likely to become one. And these threats inside the country find a favorable international environment in Tunisia's immediate neighborhood. Given the ongoing political crisis and the precarious security situation in Libya, with the presence of foreign operatives on the ground who are likely to, if the situation deteriorates, who are likely to cross the border anytime. Also, growing insecurity in the Maghrebi Sahelian borders, bordering territories, arising from the spread of jihadist insurgency across the region. And this is, I believe, a real challenge, especially with the French President Macron deciding that the Barkhane operation will end by the end of 2020. And you know, the Barkhane city force is the largest in the region, in the Sahel, and their withdrawal could be a risky a move, potentially conducive to the emergence of a caliphate in the Sahel. Also, as Antonio discussed earlier on, the fall of Afghanistan to Taliban is empowering for the overall jihadi movement and its regional offshoots in North Africa, the Sahel, and elsewhere. The Taliban's example could be a source of inspiration, could be instrumentalized by jihadi groups as opening horizons for others to promote militancy. And historically, top Tunisian jihadist leaders trained and operated in and from Afghanistan. This is notably the case of the group of Tunisians who were part of the Arab Afghans in the years 2000, and whose return to the country and imprisonment led to massive radicalization inside Tunisian prisons and the recruitment of jihadists inside prisons.
Thank you. I still have two questions, one for Julie Coleman and the other for Antonio Giustozzi. I ask you not to be too generous with the answers to my questions, so we can expand a little bit more with the following ones that are coming from the audience. But it's important to answer these questions as well. One is radicalization in prisons. Julie Coleman, which has long been a key issue in the EU as well as in the MENA region, where detention centers are often being turned into recruitment and proselytization hubs by a wide array of extremists. The rate of terrorist recidivism in Europe is low, but attacks either behind bars or by released prisoners did happen and seem to be on the increase. So what are the most significant challenges, and how can the EU and MENA governments strengthen their commitment to fight against the threat posed by radicalization in prison?
Thank you for the question, and I'm pleased that you sort of highlighted that recidivism amongst violent extremist offenders is indeed low. I think that's a good place to start, simply because we all have the tendency to really exceptionalize terrorism. But despite it being low, I think one of the key challenges is the very fact that this is such a politically sensitive issue, and there is so much pressure on different government actors to get these decisions right. Because, of course, the high-profile nature of attacks that have been carried out by former violent extremists or by those who were radicalized in prison, comes at a really high cost. But I think the first approach that Europe can take is that while prisons can be a hotbed of radicalization or a place where radicalization really takes place, they can also be an incredibly conducive and controlled environment for rehabilitation and for addressing the potential risk that an individual might pose. And the first step in addressing some of those risks, are very basic good prison practices. So implementation of what are known as the Nelson Mandela rules. And those are, based on respect for human rights and rule of law. And it's, just generally good practices that we would hope to see in all European prisons. Well-trained staff who have a good rapport with the inmates, access to healthcare, access to different rehabilitation programming, which can be, education and vocational training. It can also be psychosocial support. It can be, family therapy, even things like art or sports. these are programs that we would want to see implemented because the goal should ultimately be rehabilitation and reducing the potential risk. And so these very basic steps can be taken. And I would suggest that because European countries, countries within the EU have many more resources than those in the MENA region or in the Sahel region. And so they should really be looking at how they can best use those resources to implement some of these basic steps. Admittedly, it is a greater challenge for countries like Tunisia that already suffer from prison overcrowding and lack those resources. But I think these are some areas that can be the first steps to really addressing this problem of radicalization in prisons.
Thank you. Antonio Giustozzi, let's go back to Afghanistan. How likely it is that the Taliban will adopt their own counter-terrorism strategy against jihadist groups like, for example, Islamic State Khorasan, of course, Al-Qaeda, you already mentioned Al-Qaeda, which it's a delicate issue. How would it reflect on the international jihadist landscape? What will the end state of terrorism look like? Territorial or transnational? We also saw that the Taliban have this suicide brigade that is part of their security forces. What is the picture there? What should we understand from this scenario?
Well, but the Taliban, the Emirate, already has some kind of counterinsurgency, counter-terrorism policy. Of course, they don't use the terminology, but they've been engaged now for a few months in the repression of Islamic State activities, which actually seem to have declined in recent weeks. It's not clear whether it's a result of effective counterinsurgency or other factors, because of course it's also winter in Afghanistan, where usually the pace of military operations slows down, even if Islamic State is mostly active in areas where it's never winter, like Nangarhar or Kunar. These are essentially tropical areas, so it's not really that there's much snow there at all, even in the mountains. So we have to see, of course, to understand whether this policy is successful. The attitude towards the other jihadists, Al-Qaeda and affiliated groups, of course, is different. The Taliban have been negotiating with them now for a year and a half, certainly, or even more, basically since the Doha agreement with the Americans, essentially try to convince them to accept a new kind of agreement where they would be allowed to remain in Afghanistan as long as they committed to renounce effectively global jihad. So basically not using Afghanistan as a launch pad for attacks abroad. And they haven't been very successful. There have been a few groups that accepted reluctantly, but the main group, Central Al-Qaeda, has refused to accept such imposition. And the negotiation has been going up and down. When after the 15th of August, Al-Qaeda seemed to think that the relationship between the Taliban and the Americans was compromised, so they resumed talks. But then they realized the Taliban were actually edging close to Russia and China. That did not make Al-Qaeda happy anyway. So essentially, this negotiation not going very well, it seems. And I suspect they will not reach an agreement, because I think the top leadership of the Emirate, but even the top hardliners within the Emirate realized, having been in power now for 6 months or so, that without some support from somewhere, without good relations with most of the neighbors, if not all of them, the Emirate will not survive. They touch the reality with their hands. It's not about speculating, sitting on a sofa, drinking tea, or sitting on the carpet. Now they're in power. Now they see that there is no money. The state needs money to function, and then to keep even the Taliban together, you need money. So basically, they understand they need to compromise at least with somebody, if not with everybody. So I think the Taliban are they're still discussing exactly what to do, but certainly the idea of a jihadist regime in single country, especially landlocked like Afghanistan, is not a possibility. It's not the Soviet Union in 1917. It's a small country with no resources and no access to the sea. So they accept they have to compromise with somebody. That, I think, sets them on a collision path with Al-Qaeda as it is today, because al-Zawahiri is old and sick, so who knows how long it will remain there, and is not known for being flexible on tactics and strategies. So it may be that if he passes away or he hands over the leadership to others, Al-Qaeda might become more flexible about their role in Afghanistan. They're in a difficult position because right now they don't even have good relations with the Pakistani authorities or the Pakistani security services. They have nowhere to go, really. And al-Zawahiri apparently has moved back to Afghanistan recently, so he needs some place to stay. Then I think in terms of the impact, of whatever the Taliban do, I think it would be differentiated depending on whom we're talking about. So, of course, it's important to discuss the impact on jihadist organizations, but I personally think it's even more important to discuss the impact on those who fund jihadist organization, which is, if you like, the elephant in the room. It's never discussed, but it's obvious that organizations like Islamic State, Al-Qaeda, and some of the largest national branches of jihadism would not exist, would not be what they are. They might exist, but wouldn't be as big as they are and as powerful as they are if they didn't have major source of funding somewhere. And I think we all know what the source of funding are. The problem is that the source of funding cannot be tackled because virtually all the major governments in the West have very close economic and political relations with the places where the funding comes from. And at a diplomatic level, the problem is well recognized, but a solution has not been found up to now. And I think the important donors could be that some of these donors might revise their views. It's a fact, we hear from sources, even in Al-Qaeda, that they're very reluctant to engage in any kind of fighting with other jihadist organizations because they're afraid of that discrediting the entire jihadist cause in the eyes of donors. And I'm sure that also the fighting between Islamic State and Taliban had a negative impact in the eyes of some donors, at least, not all of them, because Salafi donors, of course, take the side of the Islamic State. But I think in general, there's a concern in the jihadist universe, that in fighting it has a very negative impact. So I'm sure that from the point of view of a number of countries in the region, and maybe beyond the region, encouraging the Taliban to intensify its counter-terrorism and counter-insurgency is seen as something positive because he has, not only because of the immediate impact on the Islamic State, but because of the implications for the entire ethos, if you like, of jihad. The idea of jihadists fighting each other like in Syria is something that could have a lot of potential from the point of view of the, if you like, world counter-terrorism.
Thank you. We received 4 questions. We have still 10 minutes to go. So I will read out questions. And the first one is by Mohammed Nasser. And I think, I'll ask this question to Dr. Emna Ben Arab. Do you think autocracy might be among the factors that could foster radicalization and eventually stimulate terrorism?
All right. Thank you for this question. So, all in all, and as it was clear in the last few years that autocracy or being on a path toward autocracy was used by, I'm talking about Tunisia here, used by Islamist parties and Nahda and all the other supporters of Islamism in general to push young people to revolt, to push young people to try to find a solution, even if this goes through violence. So yes, what's going on in Tunisia today is the state, as I said, of de-democratization is giving some reason for those looking for violence and those looking to radicalize young people to use this new situation in order to engage in jihadism and in violent extremism.
Thank you. Then the second question, I read it out first. So in the meantime, I think who among you might be responding. It's by Paul Arts, a professor at the University of Amsterdam, talking about the grievances of repressive governments. Would the panelists allow for the term state terrorism to which terrorists and jihadists react? Or is there too much sensitivity vis-a-vis the term state terrorism? Maybe Dr. Coleman? Are you okay with answering this question?
Sure. I'd be happy to give my thoughts, and yeah, perhaps if any of the others want to join in as well. I mean, I think that, you know, speaking on behalf of myself, but I think commonly within the fields, it is recognized that certain states are perpetrators of terrorism themselves. You know, there are a few maybe well-known examples that I could point to in terms of states that, you know, have already been publicly designated as terrorists. But I think whether or not states and their actions amount to terrorism, I mean, I think that there are really serious abuses, even if it falls short of being state terrorism, that are certainly real drivers of violent extremism. So as we look at the response, you know, the military and security responses that are coming from these states, you know, it is creating this sort of vicious cycle of a reaction to terrorism that fuels more terrorism in response. So as a quick thought, I would certainly say that yes, I think partly some extremist actors are indeed responding to acts of state terrorism. You're muted.
Sorry, I'm back. So we have two other questions. They don't seem to be addressed as much to jihadism and the issue of Afghanistan. So I don't know, Dr. Giustozzi, if you wish to say something on this subject, just jump in, just let me know. One is, can you touch on gendered drivers of radicalization and the impact of the pandemic on this? And the other one, this is by Anouk Hailey. And the next one is there an approach that can be regarded as setting a best practice in the MENA area and in the EU? Who feels like answering these two questions? I guess probably the second one, best practice, I would ask Dr. Coleman. And the drivers, I don't know if Dr. Ben Arab is on this one, or Antonio Giustozzi as well, if you have something to say. Hello, please.
Perhaps I can hop in and answer the question. I can jump in and respond to the question about best practices, and yeah, perhaps give some more time for some thought on the gendered question. You know, the difficulty in answering the question of what best practices we see is that I think no state has gotten it completely right, obviously. You know, countering terrorism is an incredibly complex and challenging endeavor. And so I can't, unfortunately, point to one country who seems to be, you know, addressing things right across all counts. You know, certainly in terms of best practices, what I would really advocate is that For the past 20 years, there's been a really heavy emphasis on a very securitized, military-based approach to counterterrorism. And we've seen that doesn't work. And what evidence shows actually does work is a number of things. Responses that respect human rights and rule of law. And those are often seen as sort of softer responses, or maybe sometimes dismissed as not being hard enough to counter the threat of terrorism. But we've seen evidence show that responses that are in line with those values are much more effective in the long run. And so I think that is one area to look at. And then I think other practices of where states are getting it more right, for example, are by taking a more sort of whole of society based approach. And again, this is a term that's often, seen as maybe a tick the box exercise. But I look at, some initiatives in Germany or in Austria where you have engagement of civil society actors who are working, in prisons, for example, with violent extremist offenders, where you have more inclusive approaches that don't necessarily only include security actors, but they include religious leaders, they involve community leaders, educators. We see these in a number of European countries and also in other regions. And I think those approaches have indeed been shown to be more effective. So it's a partial success in that we start to see some examples that we should be following. But unfortunately, nobody has really come up with the magical formula of how you actually tackle this problem as a whole. But I would say those types of approaches are places to start, certainly.
And very rapidly, do we have any indication that the pandemic has touched upon gendered drivers of radicalization? Dr. Benarab?
Actually, are we talking here about gender and the involvement of women in terrorism?
Well, it says gender, the drivers of radicalization. I guess so. I guess gender.
Right. Actually, we don't have exact data to answer this question, but if we talk about women and extremism, for sure they were part of the phenomenon, especially when it comes to foreign fighters. But we're part of it as wives. We're part of it of mothers of a future generation of terrorists, and this was clear in the role they assumed when they left for the Islamic State. And even today, we have a problem with women not being able to enter the country. They are stranded on the borders between Tunisia and Libya. And there is a whole discussion about their role in as being, as I said, the followers of their husbands, and whether they will constitute an ideological continuation of of their role in the Islamic State when they joined their husbands. So we don't have exact data here. I don't have precise data that I can answer this question fully.
Okay. Thank you. So I think we are done with the questions from the audience. We are already we had 1 hour. We stayed a little bit longer. It was very interesting. We had more time, luckily, to touch upon many subjects. So I thank all of you. And if we don't have anything to add as a closing sentence, I think we're all fine. I think we can close this panel. And it has been shared live, so it can be also people who didn't have the opportunity to follow it can find it online. And we say goodbye and thank you to our audience for following, and thank you to our guests. Thank you very much.
Thank you.